archaeology as a discipline is founded on two traditions, which go way, way back into the 17th and 18th centuries, where on the one hand, you have the idea that evidence is self-evident, that you can just go out and observe the world, and as you collect up facts, you'll gradually get to know the way that the world is. So this is what we would call empiricism. And in archaeology, it goes back to the antiquarians, who would simply observe evidence for the past. And if you acquire more and more of that evidence, eventually you'll understand. And on the other hand, there's what you might call a rationalist tradition, which says that rather than starting out with facts, you start out with a coherent argument. And you can trace that back to, say, the scientific revolution and more pertinently, perhaps, to the Enlightenment, where people, without using evidence at all, made up narratives about the way that they understood the development of human society. So they'd say, well, people at the beginning must have been hunters and gatherers, and then they must have developed towards agriculture and then towards the state. Or they must have started out in very small bands, and then they would have gradually developed tribal societies, and then they'd have moved eventually towards state organization. So you have these two things operating almost in total isolation from each other until you get to the beginning of the 19th century with Christian Thomson. And of course, what he does is he, on the one hand, has a kind of evolutionary narrative about the development of technology. So stone must come first, and then bronze, and then iron. And then he actually brings that into contact with material evidence. So those two things, having a good story and having a detailed understanding of the evidence, are the two foundations of archaeology. But there's always a tension between the two. And I think that tension keeps resurfacing, so that sometimes you have people who say, well, the most important thing for us to do as archaeologists is to have a coherent argument about what happened in the past. And others will say, well, nonsense, it's all got to be based on the facts. The evidence is primary. And I don't think that's a problem that we're ever really going to get away from.
How do you link the theoretical approach and the practice that you adopt within your own archaeological fieldwork?
Well, I think very much that the two sides are inextricable. So on the one hand, I will always go into the field with big anthropological questions about prehistoric societies in mind. So I will always want to know how were societies organized, what were gender relations like, why did people build monuments, how did they understand landscapes, and so on and so on and so on. And yet, when I actually get into the field, I don't accept the idea that there's any kind of separation between our philosophical ideas and the way that we actually do things in the field. I don't think that you first of all have a set of evidence which is value free, and then you come along and you interpret it as a secondary thing. And more than that, I greatly value the field experience itself. So I don't want to be separate as a kind of armchair archaeologist who has people to go out into the field for me, collecting up evidence, and then I sit back and say, this is what it all means. I actually want to be right in the process, understanding how that evidence has been generated and steering that process. So I want to be there when the machine is taking the turf off the field. I want to be there when you're cleaning the surface. I want to be the person who actually draws the plans. And then I want to actually be excavating some of the features myself and making some of the observations, so that I'm actually working through that inferential process of saying, what kind of a feature is this? How was it constructed? What is it actually telling us about what went on at this site? So I don't want there to be at any point a separation between the people who create the evidence and the people who interpret it, because I think archaeology is always going to be interpretation all the way down.
So when you make that mark with the pencil on the permatrace, that is the process of interpretation happening.
It absolutely is. There's no sense that you can make a mark in a way that is not already interpretive.
And then you're building up literally those layers of interpretation as well as layers of plan evidence.
Yeah, and it's also an iterative process. So in your observation, you're changing your understanding of what the site is about. And I think one of the nice things about doing field archaeology as a university archaeologist is that you have this process of going back and forth between the university and the field, so that each time you're coming back, you've thought about it a bit more, and your observations are again informed by what you've been thinking about over the winter.
So can you give me an example of where you started out part of the observation process? It's given you certain ideas, you've interpreted those observations in a particular way, but over time, as you've continued the process, that interpretation has developed or changed.
I think our project at Dorstone Hill is a really good example of that. We went to a site in Herefordshire with the expectation that what we were going to find was a Neolithic enclosure. There was a bank running across a field. We thought that we were going to be able to simply take the dirt off and there would be a bank, and in front of it there would be a ditch and there would be a Neolithic enclosure. In fact, the bank turns out to be 3 separate features, which are 3 long mounds arranged end to end, and underneath each one of those long mounds there's a burnt building. And yet, as we went back again and again to the same site, we found more and more things which moved our interpretation on, until eventually we found out actually there is a Neolithic enclosure in the field, but it's in an entirely different place.
And how many seasons was that?
That was 8 seasons. And I like that process. I like the way that your archaeological practice is not just in the moment that you're digging in a particular hole. It's about being in a particular place and going back to that place and gaining an understanding of that place and its history over a period that it requires a certain amount of commitment on your part.
What about looking forward? What are the things that you're excited about theoretically on the horizon at the moment, and that you're thinking about incorporating perhaps into your teaching, but also into your practice?
I think it's a really very exciting, very interesting period for archaeological thinking at the moment, because over the past 10 years or so, we've seen the impact on archaeology of what's been termed the material turn in the humanities, what are also referred to as new materialisms. So these are a set of ideas in the human sciences which are saying, let's take the material world more seriously. And you'd think that as archaeologists, we would be doing that anyway, because it's our strong suit. What we always do is we try to understand the human past through material things. But this is going a step further, and it's saying, rather than just using things as a way of getting at past people, let's take the things themselves more seriously. Let's, rather than just seeing material culture as a set of tools that human beings use, see the things alongside the people. See them as part of past societies, so that your societies in the past are not just sets of humans having relationships with each other and using tools. They're sets of relations between people and things, as well as people and people. So that we start, instead of thinking about societies as just being fleshware, we're saying maybe that is more like cyborgs. Maybe the material things are integral to what people did in the past as kind of partners as much as tools. Now, I think that's really very interesting, because if, like me, what you're interested in is prehistory and particularly the Neolithic, one of the things that's changing is that as you go from the world of hunter-gatherers to the world of farmers, there's this proliferation of material things that people are making. They're transforming their environment materially, so that you're getting pottery, you're getting new kinds of stone tools, you're getting architecture, you're getting monuments. It becomes a much denser world of crafted things. And you could say as well that domesticated animals and domesticated plants are crafted things as well. So if you start thinking about a cyborg Neolithic, which is more than human, so using ideas that people are at the moment using in order to understand the Anthropocene and the way in which at present we're creating a new world, to turn that back and to think about the Neolithic as part of that generation of the Anthropocene, part of the way in which people and things have worked together to create a new world. That, I think, is a very exciting development.
Yeah, the analogy I always use in my own mind is the mobile phone, having experienced life pre-mobile phone and post-mobile phone.
Yeah.
And seeing my daughter, for example, and how her world is different to my world at that age. So if anybody who's listening to this or watching this is interested in that idea, where would you direct them to develop their understanding? Is there any particular books or papers that you would?
Well, certainly you could look at the book that Keith Ray and I wrote together called Neolithic Britain, which very much deals with these sorts of ideas, although I'm really seeking to take them further in new work. So really it's going to be developing over the next few years. And that's really the next book that I want to write, is a book about this idea of a cyborg Neolithic. So the best thing to do is obviously to come to Manchester and be taught by us and pick up these ideas while they're actually in the process of developing.